We talk a lot about the truth. The outcome of the truth is the right outcome. We talk a lot about courage to share the truth, say it like it is, all that stuff, and that's right and that's good. But there's something that I've been reading that has caused me to want to bring, I don't know if balance is the right word. It's probably not the right word for what I'm thinking about, but it's nuance at least to this idea that we're going to be truth bearers and sharers of the truth. One of my favorite authors, as you know, if you've known me for very long, is Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is a farmer in Kentucky of a family farm, and he grew up on a family farm nearby his family farm. And he writes about farming. He writes about all kinds of things. He writes about social things. He's a Christian. He writes novels. So some of his books are nonfiction, and some of them are novels, and some of them are books of poetry. And he is just great. And if you've never read any of his books, I highly recommend that you do. And if you want to start with the nonfiction, I would start with The Unsettling of America, written in honor of Roxanne's graduation. Or no, Richard's actually in 1974. Um, but and then his fiction is on the same topics that he writes his nonfiction about. And so he's a really good example of someone who can spread a message through fiction. And it's really neat to see and go between his nonfiction and his fiction. He writes about a little town in Kentucky that's a lot like his, and it's basically family farming communities, and it's and his novels will span like 150 years. So they may be about Civil War time, they may be about 1985, but it'd be the same families, and you'll see the same names showing up again and again. And he deals with these themes of the change that came over America, particularly when it comes to going into like big agriculture from family farms. And if you guys love any small rural towns, then you probably know the transformation that happens when instead of 15 family farms, there's one corporation farm. And then suddenly it changes everything about the town. So he writes about that a lot, and I really love it. But the latest book that I've been reading is called The Need to Be Whole. Now, Barry is almost 90, if he's not already. And he in this book he takes aim at racism, and he talks about patriotism and the history of prejudice. And he spends a lot of time talking about Kentucky and the Civil War. Now, Kentucky and the Civil War was a Union state where half the people in it fought for the Confederacy, and sometimes people fighting each other from the same family. And he tries to make the reader understand that this was not a simple issue. To us, it seems simple. You're either racist or you're not. You're not racist at all, so you fight for the Union, or you're very racist and you fight for the South. But he tries to get into all the nuance of that, and it's brilliant. But in this section that I want to read to you, he is talking about what he is trying to do, which is write about a controversial topic. And he's just finished writing about, now you got to understand, Wendell Berry is not, I would not in any way, shape, or form describe him as a racist. He is, I think, he loves and he is calling out a lot of racism. And he also defends Confederate statues. You know, talk about nuance. And after that, he talks about why he's trying to do that. Okay. So I hope that all I said there made you want to go read it, because it's worth a read. And you'll see why it's worth the read when I read some of it. He says, another problem for us now is that in order to speak fully, particularly, and plainly, Now, if you knew Barry's voice, you know it doesn't really work as well if you're not, if you don't have an old man's Southern drawl. He would sound like this. Another problem for us now is that in order to speak fully, particularly, and plainly, we must be willing to be known. Okay, I'm not going to keep doing that. By that, I do not mean that we should relinquish all decency and privacy. I mean merely the willingness to speak as and for ourselves, to account for ourselves, and to bear witness. This seems to have become unusually difficult perhaps because we have become so estranged from one another in our mobility and interchangeability, and therefore so vulnerable to suspicion. For the fear of being suspected of some wrong allegiance, people now are likely to identify themselves by category. They speak as representative persons, hewing to the doctrinal line and the generalized and prefabricated speech of their movement. It is clearly possible to embody pure greed in a corporation so that it invariably decides in its own interest. In the same way, pure anger or pure fear or pure hatred can be incarnated in a crowd or a movement. Individual people are more likely to have mixed emotions or to be, quote, of two minds. If they retain a measure of self-knowledge and self-possession, their speech, therefore, will be pushed toward definition, distinction, and precision. If one's anger is qualified by love or respect or kindness, or only by the wish to make sense, then it cannot disgrace itself by being pure. Think about that sentence for a minute. It's a real good sentence. If one's anger is qualified by love or respect or kindness, or only by the wish to make sense, so you're angry, but you have love, then it cannot disgrace itself by being pure. So when I say pure, this reminds me of um, when I read Metaxas's biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was talking about the unfortunate fact, even though Churchill is a hero in World War II, the unfortunate fact was his mindset that he held to with all his might was in that time the only good German was a dead German. And there was a faction, according to Metaxas, of people like Bonhoeffer who were trying to communicate with Churchill and wanted to say, hey, can we maybe help to try to get rid of this guy, Hitler, so that you don't have to wipe out our whole country? And Churchill's answer was, no, I don't want to talk to you at all. I don't want to see your face. I don't want to think that you have a mother and children. I just want to annihilate you. And that's what he felt like needed to happen in order for them to win the war. And it's hard to argue with the results. But the fact was, there were a lot of actually good, solid Christian Germans who were not on board with the Nazis and wanted to oppose them and wanted help opposing them. This is all secondhand from, somebody else's research. I'm just telling you what Metaxas said about it. Churchill was being pure. If you're going to say the only good German is a dead German, that's pure. That's totality. There's no nuance in that. Okay? I'll ask for comments in a minute, but just hold on to that thought for a second. Then he goes on, if one has considered that it may be good or even necessary to treat one's enemy as a neighbor, or that an enemy may become a friend, then the purity of one's hatred is at least complicated by the question of what must or might be done. If it is hatred that lends itself most readily to organization and is prompt to make itself at home in organizations, then those especially who wish to speak of love and of the works of love, such as forgiveness, have got to speak for themselves. They will be found always to be standing somewhat aside, listening inwardly to instruction coming from their own hearts. And then he goes on to say, to the best of my memory, the most perfected of the public angers or hatreds in this country since our hatred of the Japanese during World War II is the present politically correct or leftist hatred of the Confederacy and the Confederate soldiers. This is a moral hatred, complete to the extent of incorporating the modern day critical principle of no forgiveness. And it is a hatred uncomplicated by fear because these hated enemies are all dead. So this is just an old man who knew people as a boy who were alive during the Civil War, understanding these issues were extremely complicated back then, even more than they are now. I don't want to just read the whole book to you, so hang on a minute. He says, my friends, I think, were afraid when he had said he wanted to write about this stuff. Were afraid now that I am old that I am at the risk of some dire breach of political etiquette by feebleness of mind or some fit of ill-advised candor, and they would like me not to stir up trouble for myself, but I wonder if they have considered well enough what they have asked of me, which amounts to a radical revision of my calling. They are not asking me for my most careful thoughts on what I have learned or experienced. They are asking me to lay aside my old effort to tell the truth, as it is given to me by my own knowledge and judgment, in order to take up another art, which is that of public relations. By the rule of that art, I would exert myself to discover what would be most pleasing to the public, or some parcel thereof, and then I would conform my work to the pleasure of any group whose displeasure I may be threatened. By whose displeasure I may be threatened. I'm not going to do that. It is plain to me that I'm being asked, kindly mind you, to take the path leading to censorship and falsehood. If censorship begins, and I fear it is beginning, it surely will be accepted first by the speakers and writers who already have learned to censor themselves. I am taking the side of the First Amendment, which I am no longer willing to entrust either to the so-called liberals or to the so-called conservatives. I want to be on the side of freedom. I want to be an honest old man. I want to take the risks of my effort to be honest, just as if I were a young man trying to be honest. In my own judgment, I would be less honest, less human, and would have less hope of being useful if I agreed to or bowed to the strange principle of total hatred or total anger, or to its even stranger implication that we should condemn Lee absolutely, deny him any consideration or understanding as a figure of significance in our history, and yet keep him present and alive in our minds in order to hate him. So it's probably not wise for me to sum up his argument about the statues, but it's just like basically, how are we ever going to talk about what happened if we remove any evidence that we had this war and that we had this racism and we had slavery and things like that. And I think Barry is also saying that your faith affects your judgment, and that the purity of hatred definitely requires isolation. It requires you to dehumanize. But if you won't dehumanize, so it's like if any of us have an issue with each other, we can have a big fight, but we have a Christ-centered relationship in the capital C church. We're friends, and it's going to affect how we fight. It's going to affect how we share the truth, and it's going to affect our carefulness in the way we characterize each other, and we're not going to caricature one another, because we love each other and we know each other, and we can violently disagree with each other um, and still love each other.